All right, it is 1:30, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you to all, let's see if I can see 332 of, 333, okay, I'm gonna stop counting. 300 plus of you who are in attendance today, joining us for our webinar. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Erin Skubal. I am the Director of the Certification Division at the Commission. And if you're joining us today, you must be really excited to learn as much as you can about the Governor's Executive Order N-66-20 that was released on the 29th of May. And it provides some additional flexibilities that the Commission as a whole wasn't able to provide to program sponsors, employing agencies, and educators related to preparation, examinations, and credential requirements that have been affected by the current COVID-19 situation. So the staff at the Commission, the executive leadership worked really hard to connect with the Governor's office and help them to carve out these flexibilities for you all. So we're really happy to be able to present this to you today. So let's just do some quick introductions. As I mentioned, my name is Erin Skubal. I'm the Director of the Certification Division at the Commission, and I have Angel Lopez and Brittany Tajou here with me today. They are both managers in our Certification Division with our production unit. So they really are the folks that have their boots on the ground and are helping to answer questions as they come in through our chat and our email, and working with staff to make sure that they understand the scope of the executive order and the other flexibilities that have taken place through the Commission. So Angel and I are going to go through the slides. Brittany is also going to be available to help answer the chat questions and to kind of keep Angel and I on track so we don't veer off into some sort of crazy tangent, which sometimes we do, but we'll try to be really good today. Angel's hiding his video right now because he's got a wonky internet connection today. So we're happy that he's at least here with us via audio. So, all right.
Erin, can I interrupt you really quickly?
Yes,
just to get going. I had said when we first opened it up to external people to join us that the chat was disabled and the Q&A was the way to go. That was wrong. The chat is still available, but we do actually request that if you have a question that we haven't gotten to on a slide, to please put it in the Q&A. It's just much cleaner on our end, on the host end, to deal with questions from that window.
Perfect. Yes. Thank you, Angel. That's a perfect segue into this next slide here. So we have some webinar norms here for you that we want to just cover really quickly. So for those of you that are wondering, your microphone has been muted. The only way for your microphone to be unmuted is if one of the moderators unmutes your microphone. So we should have time at the end of the slides. We just have a few short slides here to present to you all where you can ask questions. So we'll be doing a combination of questions that are coming through the Q&A as well as audio questions that you all may have. So we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. But again, as Angel mentioned, please don't post your questions in the chat. Please post your questions in the question and answers feature so that we can keep track of those. If you want to, chat with your fellow attendees, or maybe, have a side conversation, you're welcome to do that in the chat. But the question and answer feature is where we're going to be looking for questions that we can answer at the end of the webinar through the question and answer field. And that's also where we are pulling any FAQs from. So we really appreciate you posting your questions to that Q&A specific area and not the chat. We ask that you keep your questions related to the executive order, and we know that there's lots of very specific questions. Okay, I have this one candidate who has this one specific situation, and is this going to be usable for them, or how would this be used for them? We will try to hopefully answer those questions in a broad way, but we are definitely asking that you keep the questions focused on the executive order. And we know that there may be a lot of questions that compare the executive order to the other flexibilities that the Commission has already authorized at the April meeting. And we understand that. So, feel free to kind of ask questions related to how these two different types of flexibilities might be used in conjunction with another or one versus the other. You know, you all are professionals, you know how to behave in a webinar, so we hope you're not multitasking just so you don't miss any information. But we are recording this webinar in case you missed something or you had to step away or take a call. You can access that through the Commission's video archives. So we will be recording that for you all to see in the future. Okay. So as I mentioned, we're just going to briefly go over the executive order and the specific items that that order included. We're going to provide you a little bit of guidance on the submission of online and paper recommendations related to the executive order, and then we should have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So this executive order has three main kind of ideas that are embedded in it. The first is the postponement of the RICA examination and the two assessments you see there, the TPA and the APA. So the order postpones those requirements and they move them to the clear credential. They do then have to have a renewal requirement listed on the preliminary credential when those individuals are recommended, and we'll go into a little more detail about that. So that's the one big kind of, you know, program related concession that has been made. The RICA, the Teaching Performance Assessment, and the Administrator Performance Assessment have been moved for this cohort of candidates to the clear credential, which means they can get the preliminary credential without having completed one or more of those exams. It also suspends the CBEST exam for entry into a program. So CBEST was a requirement for individuals to enter into a preparation program. It has been suspended, so programs can go ahead and enroll individuals who have not completed the CBEST if they were unable to take the exam during the dates indicated in the executive order, and we'll go into the details about those dates in just a moment. And the last kind of area that the executive order touches on is waiving of the subject matter requirement for intern credentials. So the district and university intern credentials of course, have a requirement that subject matter be met prior to either enrollment in or issuance of the intern credential. So that requirement has been postponed, and intern programs can enroll candidates who have not met subject matter. They can also recommend for intern credentials for candidates who have not met subject matter. So that's kind of a big deal, right? We're going to have folks in the classroom who are teaching who have not yet met subject matter, and we're hopeful that those intern program sponsors will get those folks, you know, completing the exam as soon as possible, as soon as those testing centers are open. But right now, we don't know when those testing centers are going to be fully open and operational. So that's why this requirement has been postponed, and these individuals will have to meet it prior to recommendation for the preliminary credential. So you'll see the first bullet there, the postponement of RICA, TPA, APA, those allow someone to go get a preliminary credential without having met a requirement. The second two, the CBEST and the subject matter being waived for program enrollment, those two are just for program enrollment, and it's not necessarily allowing someone to be issued a preliminary credential without those requirements, okay? I want to make that distinction. Top one, they can get a preliminary without those requirements. The bottom two, that's for program enrollment, and they cannot get a preliminary credential without CBEST or subject matter being met. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit with the TPA and the APA. So in the governor's executive order, these two flexibilities are basically mirror images of each other. The language is exactly the same. So whether you're looking at someone who was unable to complete the TPA or someone who was unable to complete the APA, the criteria is going to be the same. Candidates must have been enrolled in their preparation program during the 1920 academic year. And they need to meet the following. They need to have been placed or employed in a local educational agency that was impacted by COVID-19 related school site closures. We know that's almost every school, although there are, anecdotally, I've heard there were some districts that did not shut down, but this is going to be almost every school. So it's highly likely that your candidates were affected in this way. The second criteria, they were in the process of completing the TPA or the APA, obviously, if that's what the individual was going for their administrative credential. And they were unable to complete the TPA or APA due solely to school closures. And finally, they successfully completed all other preliminary credential requirements. One of the questions we've been getting is, well, what if this is somebody who needed to complete both the TPA and RICA? Say they are a multiple subject credential candidate and they did not complete the TPA and they did not complete RICA because those testing centers closed, and their placement as a student teacher was obviously halted because of the school closures. Can they use both of these executive order flexibilities congruently? And the answer is yes, they can. So where it says successfully completed all other preliminary credential requirements, we are understanding that the RICA also being suspended kind of removes that as a preliminary credential requirement, and it has moved to the clear credentials. So someone can combine both the TPA and the RICA executive order flexibilities and be recommended for the preliminary credential without having met both of those. Something to keep in mind, the executive order does not define what the 1920 academic year is. So that is something that the program sponsor needs to define, right? Program sponsors understand their academic year. They understand when their enrollments are taking place. And so obviously an academic year that is classified as 1920 can't go beyond December 31st of 2020, right? If we're in the year 2021, we can't justify that as being considered the 1920 academic year. But, you know, an academic year could be, you know, monthly enrollments. And so it's possible that folks may have been enrolled in their prep program, you know, in December of 2019. That's their initial enrollment, and that still would mean that they are considered a candidate and enrolled for the 1920 academic year. So that's just something that preparation programs are going to have to work out and define for themselves. The commission does not have a definition of that. That's going to be varied by preparation program. Okay, so a little bit more about the TPA and the APA. Employers need to refer to the renewal requirements on the preliminary document that an individual who's being recommended under this flexibility is issued for the best information. So those of you who are going to be looking to hire these candidates that have a preliminary credential that are going to have these additional renewal requirements, you need to be aware of that. You need to pay close attention to that. And I know you all are very used to you know, looking at those renewal requirements for folks who are maybe prepared out of the United States, from another state. And so it's going to be very similar, right? You're going to just be making sure that you're aware that the candidate, the teacher, or the administrator is aware what they need to do. And we're all going to work really hard to make sure that 5 years from now, these folks aren't going, wait, what do you mean I had to complete a TPA or an APA? They're going to be, they're not going to be surprised. They're going to know what to expect. You as the employer are going to know what to expect. And hopefully they've completed it well before the 5 years is up. But you never know. It always happens that we have a few stragglers, right? For the administrative certificate of eligibility, those documents typically don't get issued with any type of renewal requirement under normal circumstances. Under these circumstances, because we want to make sure that there's no possibility that they might be eventually issued a preliminary credential where the APA renewal requirement was inadvertently left off, we're going to be putting that APA renewal requirement on the certificate of eligibility when the recommender completes that. So you'll see these candidates with a CE or certificate of eligibility, and they'll have that APA renewal requirement listed on it. Now that doesn't mean that they need to complete the APA prior to obtaining an administrative position and getting recommended for the preliminary credential via paper application. That's not the case. I know that sounds a little counterintuitive. Why would you put a renewal requirement on there if they don't have to complete that prior to moving to the next level of the document? But remember, the certificate of eligibility is really just a placeholder that is intended to mirror the preliminary document. And we're just waiting for this individual to obtain employment in an administrative position. So therefore, we're putting the APA renewal requirement on those CEs, and they just need to meet that after they've been issued the preliminary before they get the clear. Okay, so hopefully that kind of clears up any confusion about that. You're going to hear this a lot. You know, we want these candidates and you all as the employers to work closely with the preparation programs to see who may or may not qualify under these executive order flexibilities, and to ensure that the documents are issued appropriately and properly, as well as working with the induction program sponsors as folks move towards completing these requirements. Now, we're not really going to get into any of that information today. That's really the professional services division's area of expertise. But, you know, folks will have to complete the TPA or the APA through the support of their induction program sponsor. So employers, make sure you're kind of, you know, facilitating that conversation with the induction program and the candidate and the prep program as you're hiring these individuals.
Erin, really quick before you move on, there's a question that I think pertains to that. It says, was in the process of completing the TPA, does this mean attempted?
It doesn't necessarily mean attempted. So somebody could have enrolled in their very first TPA cycle and had that administration canceled, right? So they may not have attempted or taken any of the 3 cycles. You may have folks that completed 2 out of the 3 cycles, 1 out of the 3 cycles. They may have completed none of the 3 cycles. But that's going to be up to the preparation program to kind of define, you know, what they're considering as evidence that someone was moving towards and ready to take the TPA or the APA, but was unable to do so because of COVID. So again, they may not have technically taken any of the 3 cycles for either of the assessments, but you know, if they were on track and they had planned and you all as a prep program were clearly aware that they were going to be taking the TPA or the APA in March, April, May, June, that would be a qualifying, you know, consideration. So thank you, Brittany, for throwing that question out there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about RICA. So the interesting thing about the executive order is that for TPA and APA, like I mentioned, the language is almost identical for those 2 flexibilities. It has those very specific criteria that an individual needs to have met in order to be able to use those flexibilities. For RICA, it's different. There's no mention of enrollment in the program during the 1920 academic year. So that's something to consider. And that means that somebody does not need to have been enrolled during the 1920 academic year to use this flexibility. The requirement here is basically that if someone was unable to complete the RICA examination or take the RICA examination between March 19 of 2020 and August 31st of 2020, then they can qualify for this flexibility, if that is the only credential requirement they have remaining. Now, that's going to be a significantly different population of individuals than the first 2 flexibilities with the TPA and the APA, because we know that RICA is often a barrier for candidates, and that we in certification have seen, you know, request after request to extend a waiver or an interim credential because someone wasn't able to complete the RICA. So for those folks, if they can verify with the program sponsor who they completed their preparation program through, that they were unable to complete the RICA exam between March 19, 2020 and August 31, 2020, that program can recommend them for the preliminary credential if they've met all other requirements. Now, it's going to be at the program's discretion to define what that means as far as verifying that they were unable to take the exam. You know, the executive order is silent on what that means. So as a prep program, you may, you know, request that the individual provide documentation that they had registered for the exam and were unable to take it, that registration was canceled. You may not, you know, you may just say the circumstances, the current circumstances that we're seeing, you know, it was impossible for someone to register. Maybe they were planning on taking it in June, and the registration for the June test dates wasn't open prior to March 19th, and so there's no way they could have registered for the examination in June. So again, that's at the prep program's discretion, and if any of you employers out there have individuals who fall into this category, they're going to have to work with their prep program to see if the program will recommend them based on this flexibility. Okay. Here's another interesting avenue that's come up: private school experience candidates. So individuals who were unable to complete the RICA exam and are applying based on private school experience, SB 57, they can take advantage of this flexibility. Okay, so because they are completing the requirements, if they have less than 6 years of experience, they're completing the preparation program requirements through a prep program, they're going to need to submit their application in coordination with the program sponsor. If they have more than 6 years of private school experience, they can apply directly to the commission and submit verification that they were unable to complete the RICA exam. So again, all of the requirements need to be met, right? It's not just that they can get their preliminary credential if they also need to complete some other requirement. It definitely is, RICA was the only barrier, the only thing that they were missing, and that is the only step that they have left to complete in order to qualify via private school experience. Then they could use this option. And then you can see the last bullet there. Regardless of the route, they need to prove that they were unable to take the RICA exam during those specific dates. And I know it says September 31st there, but it actually should be August 31st. Okay, so now let's switch gears, right? We've talked about the flexibilities that allow someone to obtain their preliminary credential without having completed either TPA, APA, or RICA. Now let's talk about the flexibilities with CBEST and subject matter. So again, these are for folks entering preparation programs. And it's only clearly affects those entering the program in the 2021 school year, right? Because 1920 was already in full effect and almost completed by the time the COVID situation started. So these are folks that are new program enrollees, right? They have been trying to enter a program on or after March 19 of 2020. For interns, they should be treated the same as far as their authorization goes, just like they were in the past, so there's no difference there. The basic skills and the subject matter renewal requirements are not going to be listed on the intern credential recommends. So that's because they're program requirements. They're not necessarily, I mean, eventually every single program requirement ends up being a certification requirement, right? Because you can't obtain certification without completing that program. But we're not listing the basic skills or the subject matter requirement on intern credentials where somebody utilized this flexibility to enroll in a program, because for the intern credential, they need to have been enrolled in and sponsored by a program sponsor. They're doing that, they're just using this flexibility. So we've been getting a lot of questions about that. We aren't going to be listing the basic skills or the subject matter renewal requirements on the intern credentials. So I think I'm going to hand it over to Angel so he can talk a little bit more about online recommends and some of the nitty-gritty details that are important to know, either if you are submitting recommends or if you're an employer and you just kind of want to understand how the process is going to work. You can assist educators who might be in this situation, and then you'll understand what you're going to see on documents where someone has applied using this flexibility.
Thanks, Erin. So online recommendation is really still the most common way that you're going to handle people who are taking advantage of the options established by the executive order. The definite sort of outlier is that people who are taking advantage of that RICA option for private school, they'll have to apply with a paper application. So most of you won't even see that. So just know that that's out there though. Now this next bullet though is kind of a big one. May 29th is the effective date of the executive order. That's the day that it was really handed down to us. So anybody with an application, recommendation, what have you, that's using one of these options, it has to come in to us with an issuance date on or after May 29th. We have already received a few recommendations, and our staff has been working diligently to sort of stop those if they requested was before May 29th, and reach out usually with an email to the analyst letting them know, like, listen, we can't do that. It has to be May 29th or moving forward from that. Can we change it? So if you by any chance have made a recommendation and you know that you requested something before May 29th and you haven't heard from the commission yet, please send us an email. Please send us the names of those individuals so that we can double check. This is all happening so fast. We you know, there's a part of me that really hates asking that, but at the same time, we're just doing our best to cover all our bases, and we just don't want a few to slip through and maybe cause some other problems down the line, just for that one reason. So another question we've gotten is around the interns, and with them no longer having to pass the CSET to begin the program, people have asked, like, hey, should I just add a new authorization, or rather a new renewal requirement, noting that this person is taking advantage of that they have to do X, Y, Z? No, that's not necessary. Don't worry about it. We ask that you, as the program sponsor, keep that information with yourselves in your records there, but we are just going to be looking for passage of that exam, or the BSR, as the case may be, before the issuance of the preliminary. And of course, that leads to other questions, such as for the authorizations. We've gotten questions of people asking, what did they put? Because the authorization code that would normally get added to the document is a little bit different depending on whether it was met through exams or met through like a subject matter waiver letter. And so to that, I just say, as it says on that second to last bullet, either is okay. Because realistically, if they're taking advantage of the EO option, they haven't met it. So neither one of those is technically correct, but there's no other option that we have in the system. There's no other code that says this code was created because of the executive order and it means XYZ. We're not going to spend time and hold things up and doing that. So just go ahead and choose whichever one you'd like, just as long as it's in the subject area that they hopefully will pass. And then the last one is, again, it was a different field when you're making the online recommendation of the subject matter qualification route. So it's very similar to the one right above it, just in a slightly different spot. And that one you can just leave blank. And next slide, please. So I know we already said it, but it's so important and it's more crucial now than ever. So please, if any of you are out there are working with induction programs, if you are an induction program, please make sure that you are reviewing all of the renewal requirements listed on the preliminary. As Aaron pointed out, a lot of times it's not as easy as just induction because of people from out of state or out of country. And now with all of these options, it's going to be even more so. So please, please, please look at those preliminaries, look at what it actually says, and adjust accordingly and help your people get to the clear accordingly. When making online recommendations and taking advantage of the executive order options for RICA, TPA, and APA, uploading the exam scores, or the score report rather, is not required with the recommendation, but it is such a best practice. We are finding that there are a few cases where these scores are not actually loaded into our database the way we normally expect them to be. Primarily it's with those people who maybe like did the APA early and were like the non-consequential group because they were part of the first ones before the final passing scores on the cycles were established. They may have a physical paper that they've shown you that shows that they're all set, but we're not going to see it in our system. So it is a best practice. If you have all those, please scan them and load them up as attachments when you make those recommendations. Because otherwise, if we don't have it, we're just going to start a back and forth. Our analysts are going to reach out to you until we can figure out what's going on. And that has happened multiple times already. Again, the deferred APA on the CE, employer educator can apply for the preliminary, and the APA renewal code is just going to transfer over. Again, just a second reminder, we touched on that a little bit before, but the key here that we didn't touch on in that previous slide was that just like it exists now. An educator can get that form showing that they've secured a position, and they can apply to us with that form and an app and fee, and we're going to take care of that CE. So just know that they should be ready for that as well as you. And I think it's time for this Q&A business. And I know that there's plenty of questions being asked in the chat. I want to go back to something first, though, that Aaron touched on, and that was with individuals who had a RICA in years past. I have gotten it doubly confirmed. I had already heard it from Terry Clark, the head of the PSD division, but I got it doubly confirmed while we were on this. And it is very true that those people who had completed everything else and the coursework is still current. So, if they're too old, some of that coursework might have expired, and that's up to the program. But if their coursework is still current and they completed everything but the RICA, they must be recommended for the preliminary with that additional code on there. And that was her word, must. So take that as strongly as you will. I know there's a lot of people giving like, well, what about this and that? Consider what was said. Consider that it is a must if RICA was all they had left. And I think with that, we should see about taking a question.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, Angel. Brittany, as you're looking for a question for us to answer, I'll just kind of add a little bit more on that. Because the governor has officially postponed these requirements, what that means is that a program doesn't have the option to deny someone's ability to use this requirement just because maybe they think, well, you weren't the best candidate and you've failed RICA 14 times. And I know you were registered in April to take it again, but I really just I'm not confident that it would have mattered. And so therefore we don't want to recommend you. The program doesn't have the legal authority to do that as far as we are understanding things. So therefore, the program can't deny a candidate solely because of that. Now, if they have some other requirement that they haven't met, absolutely the program must then hold that individual and not recommend them for the preliminary credential and either provide flexibility through the program sponsor variable term waiver or allow them to complete that remaining requirement. But there's no authority for the program to hold them and deny that document, that preliminary document, if they really only have that one specific requirement left to meet.
Okay, are you guys ready for questions?
Yeah.
So our first question says, many programs are including their appeasement letter or letters of good standing that their candidates will be eligible for the variable term waiver if they do not meet the requirements for their preliminary. If this is the case, are we still required to hire credentialed individuals before interns, before emergency permit, before waivers? If so, am I correct in thinking these individuals are going to be the last to be eligible as they will be on waivers?
Okay, so it sounds like this question is specific to credential candidates who are likely going to be issued the program sponsor variable term waiver. Now, one thing to keep in mind, is that the program sponsor variable term waiver was approved by the commission in April of 2020 at the commission meeting. And between the close of that meeting and May 29th, we didn't know if another option was going to exist. So employers, it's very possible that that candidate who received that letter from their program sponsor and that program sponsor thought that that was going to be the only avenue for that candidate, and that they were going to have to get the program sponsor variable term waiver, that is no longer the only option for that candidate, that candidate may now be able to actually obtain their preliminary credential. So number one, I wouldn't necessarily presume that all of those folks that have those letters are going to end up with the program sponsor variable term waiver. It's quite possible that the majority of them are actually going to be able to be recommended for the preliminary. But that being said, there is nothing that has suspended the statute that includes the hiring hierarchy. So that is still technically in statute. And the program sponsor variable term waiver is still a waiver document. So, those same rules apply. However, it is local level flexibility that determines, who the best candidate is. And so, I think that you have to keep that in mind. It's not necessarily solely based just on the document held. So it's the entire picture, and you're looking at making sure that you've given a flexible option to everyone to interview or to evaluate their applications. And sometimes your number one candidate might be a waiver holder that just, has some qualification that puts them ahead of a fully credentialed teacher. Is that going to happen often? I highly doubt that. And the hiring hierarchy does require that you recruit for that fully prepared teacher, number one. So you need to follow those recruitment requirements. You need to follow those rules and regulations. And it's still a local level decision on how you're going to implement that.
Okay, so we have another one. Oh,
go ahead.
Another question regarding the program of PSBTW. So we are struggling how to determine when a student should get a PSBTW versus university intern. In both cases, they don't need to have the CBEST or CSET completed, and there can be an outstanding requirements. So can you qualify? Can you qualify how we would identify the appropriate pathway?
So if we're looking at the pathway between program-sponsored VTW, we're talking about a university intern, it sounds like. So they've been serving on an intern credential. And then we have the EO flexibilities that exist to obtain the preliminary credential. So number one, if they're an intern and they've been serving on an intern credential and they're going to continue in their intern placement, we advise that that intern apply for an extension by appeal through their program sponsor and with the support of the employer, that they maintain the intern credential. Okay, at the April Commission meeting, we opened up the flexibilities for those intern program sponsors to request additional extensions, even if someone has exhausted their intern extensions previously. So our advice is that that individual apply for an extension by appeal for their intern credential, and they have that intern credential issued for an additional year so that they can complete those examinations that they were unable to complete. If the intern is no longer with the employer that they were originally placed with, or they're maybe moving to a new intern program, they could be issued the program sponsor variable term waiver. The intern program could request the program sponsor variable term waiver. But again, we don't feel that that is the best pathway. The continued affiliation with the intern program sponsor through the intern credential being extended, we feel is the best way for these individuals to be supported and to ensure that they are able to complete their program. If they haven't completed CBEST and or CSET, then the executive order flexibility would not apply because again, the CBEST and CSET flexibilities in the executive order are just for folks entering the program, not for program completion and issuance of the preliminary credential. So hopefully that answers that question. EO not an option, intern extension definitely an option and the preferred option. Program sponsor variable term waiver also an option. Now, if you're talking about an intern who just needs to complete RICA, then they can go ahead and be recommended for the preliminary credential. So it depends on what requirement is holding them back as well.
Okay, so our next question is regarding the waiving of CSETs. So is the waiving of CSET for interns only available for new and admits in the 2020-2021 year? Can someone admitted in the 2019-2020 now be eligible for the intern credential without subject matter?
So that's a really good question, and you'll see that you'll note that the slide said 2021 school year, and that came directly from the Professional Services Division. So while I can't speak to how that determination was made, I do know that they have made that determination. If you want to go ahead and submit a follow-up question to the Professional Services Division, you could send that question in email to psdinfo@ctc.ca.gov to get clarification on that. because again, we are not necessarily the program experts in the certification division, and Terry Clark and her team would likely be able to help kind of explain the differences between those two cohorts and why they're indicating that one cohort is eligible to use that flexibility and the other isn't.
Okay, so our next question, CBEST suspension for entry into a program. Does this now mandate employers to hire someone without CBEST, or is this explicitly in relation to enrolling in a teacher preparation program? Can an employer still hold to CBEST as a condition of employment?
This is a really interesting question. So yes, the executive order is specific to program enrollment. So it is something that is only applicable to an individual who's attempting to enroll in a teacher preparation program and was unable to complete the CBEST exam. It is silent on employers' ability to hold someone for completion of the basic skills requirement. So, again, I am not a lawyer, but the plain language of the executive order would indicate to me that that employer requirement is something that can still be held for. But I would caution you to, check with your own legal counsel to ensure that that is an appropriate thing to do.
Erin, can I pop in really quickly to address something that I'm seeing several questions about, and it's not the first time I've seen this, but it seems that several people are wondering about this RICA option through the executive order and wondering if someone who has taken the exam and failed it, if they're still able to do what the executive order says. And yes, it doesn't matter if they took it and failed it or failed part of it or whatnot. I think what's happening is because there's just so much new information out there and so many things that are being worked at different levels, that sounds to me like it's getting mixed in with the commission action regarding the waiving of the CBEST and as a basic skills. And that one does have the whole thing where if you took all 3 sections, didn't pass, you don't get to do it. That only applies right there. And that only applies right there, so much so that just means if you were going to do that waiver of the basic skills based on commission action, this entire other waiving of the basic skills to enter a program based on the executive order action also does not care if the individual took it more than once. They're totally separate, even though they're talking about the same requirement. They're talking about that requirement at different aspects. Rather different points of the person's journey, right? The executive order is talking about people entering the program, whereas the other one is for pretty much anything else. So be careful not to confuse those two. If someone has taken it and failed, yes, they can still use it based on the rules in the executive order. If someone took and failed part of the RICA, yes, it's totally fine to recommend them based on the executive order.
That's a really good point, Angel. And I kind of want to piggyback off that a little bit to say, the commission's action to defer the CBEST for 1 year, that action was taken in April. And at that point, it was allowable for enrollment into a program with the exception of the issuance of the intern credential, right? We weren't able to take action on that, but it was a waiver for enrollment in a program or a waiver for issuance of a document that required CBEST. And it was a waiver of 1 year. But again, the statute did not apply to anyone who had failed the exam. So now that we have the executive order, that order doesn't have that restriction that someone was unable to fail the exam. So for program enrollment and for issuance of an intern credential, anyone who failed CBEST can still qualify to enroll in a program or to be issued an intern credential. So that means that the commission's flexibility really now only applies to individuals who are applying for a document. That's really now at this point the only time that CBEST deferral should be used for somebody who's applying for a document that requires CBEST, requires basic skills, but they were unable to complete it. That also means, though, that restriction that they can't have failed the CBEST still applies. So program enrollment, now all of you program sponsors can just rely on the executive order. You're not limited by 1 year any longer. The person can be in the program for 2 years. and you don't have to worry about them meeting the CBEST, although highly recommend that you have them take the CBEST or meet basic skills as soon as possible. But you also don't have to worry about whether they've already attempted and failed CBEST at all. So that's a really good distinction to make.
Okay, our next question. What if someone is recommended for the preliminary credential with the TPA restriction, but are not hired during the next school year? Will the educator complete the TPA on their own, or are IHEs required to still support them when they are no longer affiliated with the university due to possession of the credential?
That's a really good question, and I'm not prepared to dive into how the program is required to or not required to support them. My understanding is that once that recommendation for the preliminary credential is made, that that obligation by the preparation program is no longer there. So that is a difference between the program sponsor variable term waiver and the recommendation for the preliminary credential. With the program sponsor variable term waiver, the program is still obligated to maintain affiliation and support that candidate. Once the preliminary credential recommendation is made, in essence, that candidate has completed the program because the governor has pushed that one specific requirement to the clear credential. So now this is a clear credential requirement, which means that the support needs to come from the induction program sponsor. And it is my understanding, and Angel or Brittany, jump in if I'm wrong in this, but it's my understanding that someone can't just go take the TPA on their own. That's not how the TPA works. It's not like the CBEST or the CSET exam. They have to have program affiliation, and that program would be the induction program at this point once they're recommended for the preliminary.
Aaron, that's my understanding as well. And this whole thing, it really is, we have to all think about this and accept this, that this is not going to run the way things have run in the past. There needs to be a much tighter connection between like employers / induction programs and the program sponsors, just because you're right, that TPA is not something that someone just, off the street can say like, I'm going to sign up for the TPA. They can't just go take care of that. So programs, the final answer to that particular question would have to come from our professional services division. But I really believe that there's going to be advice on that to keep supporting them and to help them get past that particular requirement, because there's very little out there besides the preparation program that knows how to handle that.
Okay, so our next question, are postponements for the whole school year? Can interns be enrolled in a program after August 31st, 2020 without CSETs being passed? Are programs confused about the timeline?
Okay, so as you saw in the slide, the flexibility for program enrollment is aligned with the 2021 school year. So that is for new enrollees. Again, that information came from the Professional Services Division, so you're going to want to email psdinfo@ctc.ca.gov to get clarification on that. But again, the executive order doesn't define the academic year for us. It tells us that the TPA, APA requirements have to fall within the 1920 academic year, and that an individual needed to have been enrolled during that year, and that the CSET and the CBEST suspension for program enrollment is obviously for new enrollees, right? Because anyone who's already enrolled in a program should have already met that requirement. So, to get a very clear answer on that one, I'd like you all to email the Professional Services Division, but the information that they've provided to us is that it's for new program enrollees in the 2021 academic year.
Aaron, I want to just add a little bit to that. You're absolutely right. That 8/31 date, though, that did come up in the last webinar with Terry Clark. And I'm going to take a quick side trip and tell people that we do, as the commission, we do have a YouTube channel. And all of the webinars, not just ours, but previous ones by other divisions, are also just being uploaded on there. I just double checked. It looks like 1 day ago, they got the preliminary, the program update teacher prep executive order webinar up there, which touches on this question in greater detail. But, a lot of people are asking about the final date that they can recommend someone and take advantage of these. In that previous webinar, that did come up, and we talked about how that 8/31 date will be the final issuance date for using some of these options, not the final submission date, because people were talking about that, 90-day rule, that they can request an issuance date prior to the date it actually gets submitted. That is all still out there. That is all still active. We can't say, and there's no point in saying that is the ultimate cutoff, because this COVID situation really is still out there and it's still evolving. And we have spoken on our end about the possibility of requesting that things like the EO or the commission action be extended if the situation continues to be bad. So please bear with us that we can't give you such hard dates as we would like to give. But as far as to the question of submission, yes, it's at 8/31 as an issuance date, not the final date to just send it to us.
Thanks, Angel. That's good clarification to make.
Yep, and our next question kind of ties into that regarding the dates. It says, I'm curious what happens after September 1st, 2020. Our schools will be virtual during the entire fall semester of 2020. Will flexibility like the TPA still be offered? Will the CTC continue to accept electronic signatures on paperwork and applications?
Okay, well, let's start with the end of that. The commission will absolutely continue to accept electronic signatures on applications and paperwork. And one thing I do want to stress, though, is that for those of you who are employing agencies assisting candidates to submit applications that have yes answers to the professional fitness questions, I do want to stress that our Division of Professional Practices does reserve the right to request an ink signature anytime someone answers yes to one of the professional fitness questions. So, it might be a best practice if you see that somebody's answered yes to one of those questions that you jump through the hoops to get that ink signature, because the application will likely just be coming back to you at some point in the future to request that ink signature. So I know I'm segueing. Brittany's going to keep me on track though. But yes, we will continue to accept electronic signatures on documentation. And we are looking at ways to make that a permanent policy. So we're in the 21st century, and we're getting down with Adobe Signature and all that fun stuff. It's really exciting. Learned something new about how to sign in a PDF recently. That was really cool. And now I've forgotten what the first part of the question was, Brittany. See, I segued too far. Bring me back, Brittany.
I gotta bring back the question. That
means you forgot too.
I know. That's my bad. And now I can't find the question.
Okay, so
I found it. It. Will flexibility like the TPA still be offered past the September 1st, 2020 date?
Gotcha. Okay, so that is really up to the governor's office. Again, as Angel just mentioned, we are committed to continuing to fight for flexibilities that are truly needed. So if we see the current situation continuing past August 31st, then we'll absolutely continue to voice the need to extend the provisions of the executive order beyond that date. So to be determined, but we're not looking at this as the rubber stamp and we're all good now and everything's just going to be fine after this. We do realize and understand that continued flexibility may need to be authorized by both the commission and the governor's office. And while we don't necessarily have control over whether the governor's office will or will not extend this flexibility, if things continue in this way, we can promise you that we will advocate for that if we see that is necessary. Another thing is that at the June commission meeting, there will be an item related to COVID flexibilities and some of the things that the commission has done, the work we have done already, along with possible additional pathways forward in the future. So highly recommend that you all check that item out. That should be posted by the end of this week, the actual item.
Okay, our next question. To document that they were unable to take the RICA, it sounds like we as a program can be strict or flexible. We can require registration, cancellation, or nothing, knowing that test centers were closed. Is this correct?
Yeah, I think that you as the program sponsor have the discretion to identify how you're going to handle this at the local level. I advise not doing it in a vacuum. I advise, really kind of consulting with the powers that be at your institution and making sure that, you have a written policy, you have something in place that you can fall back on, that you're not making these decisions willy-nilly. But yes, you have the ability to kind of determine what you're going to consider as evidence that someone was unable to take the exam. And as always, be sure to keep record of that in each educator's academic record so that when the Professional Services Division does their accreditation site visits, that they, have that evidence there for them.
Okay, and I know we're getting close to the 2:30 time, so hopefully we can get a few more questions in. So our next question, is the CSET postponement for any intern entering a program or only those interns impacted by COVID-19 testing center closures? We have many people now wanting internships solely due to the EO with no history of having an exam scheduled and then canceled because of closures.
So again, that's going to come to the program's definition of someone verifying that they were unable to complete that requirement due to COVID. As the program sponsor, are you going to ask all candidates to provide some documentation that they attempted to register for the exam, or that, they had an exam canceled on them? The executive order is silent in those details. So that's a local level decision that your program needs to make.
Verifying, providing proof of this is not required to be provided. If provided to the program, they will not need to send this to the CTC for the preliminary recommendation. I'm not exactly sure what, this was from Janelle King. So if you're still on, if you can clarify your question, it says verifying, providing proof of this is not required to be provided to the CTC. If provided to the program, they will not need to send this to the CTC for the preliminary rec.
So it sounds like maybe Janelle's asking about evidence that someone was unable to complete the TPA, the APA, or the RICA. So if the question is, does the program sponsor need to submit documentation with the recommendation? No, the program sponsor does not need to submit documentation with the recommendation that someone was unable to complete TPA, APA, and or RICA, and therefore is being recommended without that requirement being met. What the program might want to do for all recommendations, as Angel mentioned, is when somebody is completing with completion of the TPA or the APA to provide an attachment that shows those passing scores. Because right now our staff is really trying to weed through recommendations where some people did complete those requirements and they really aren't being recommended based on this EO flexibility. But we've never in the past needed to look for TPA or APA or RICA specifically, because we knew if you all as the program are submitting the recommendation, they completed everything, right? There's no case under which you as the program sponsor, as the preliminary program, would ever submit a recommendation without somebody passing RICA or without somebody completing the TPA. So our staff didn't need to verify each of those individual components. Well, now we have a mixture of people who did complete it and who didn't complete it. And because this is also new, they're really taking their time to dig deep and make sure that if somebody does not have the TPA or the RICA or the APA renewal requirement listed, okay, that they verify that those assessments or exams were met. And the reason we're doing that is because we know, this is a new process and somebody may submit that recommendation and forget to add that renewal requirement on there. So we just want to make sure that no mistakes are made and that we're only allowing those individuals to earn the preliminary credential if that renewal requirement is listed on their document. So again, no evidence needs to be submitted specifically that says, okay, they couldn't take RICA and here's why, and we justified it this way. But best practice might be to submit those passing score reports or even attach a letter saying this person did not complete TPA and I'm recommending for the preliminary with the TPA renewal requirement. You know, again, it's not required. We're not going to reject you, but if we can't verify that someone passed TPA through our internal database, then we are going to reach out to you as the program sponsor just to make sure that you didn't inadvertently leave the TPA renewal code off of that document.
Okay, so we're at the...
Go ahead, Brittany.
All right, I was going to say we're at the 2:30 time.
All right, Angel, anything you want to add before we wrap this up?
You know, the only thing I want to say is that I would really recommend that everyone really double check the document that we have on our COVID guidance page. The document is titled Guidance Regarding Executive Order Actions Related to COVID-19. And really, really pay attention to the language. Put on your lawyer hats. Some of you might be lawyers, I don't know, but really look at the language and look at what it says, because there's been some back and forth, some misinformation, and that really comes down to the reading of the language on them. So for example, some people think that someone has to be enrolled in a certain year, and then if you go back to the requirement listed on that guidance document, it doesn't say that they had to be enrolled in that particular year. It gives other things that they had to have met, other like benchmarks for them to use one of those options, but it doesn't say that specific thing. So I would recommend everyone go back and double check the language and really make sure that what maybe you think about something, or you think like this is what someone has to have had happen to them in order to take advantage of this executive order action, to make sure that that's really, really true.
Yes, really great point, Angel, because these aren't one size fits all, you know, executive order requirements. They really, based on what the what specifically is being waived, there is different criteria and different populations of individuals that are going to be able to take advantage of those. So really good advice there. And with that, we'll go ahead and sign off. Thank you all so much for attending. As we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we will be posting this to the Commission's YouTube page. There will be a link in the COVID guidance page for this webinar, along with all of the other webinars that the Professional Services Division has put forward. And have a great weekend, everybody. Stay safe, and we'll see you all later.